You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. Time to celebrate the very best of what 2021 had to offer with Talking Images' yearly countdown of our favorite films of the year that was. I'm Chris, and as always I'm joined by Mathieu, Saul, and Tom as we reveal our top 10 films of the year with increasingly more detail and increasingly more passion. First, each of us will reveal our 10 to 6 favorite film of the year more or less as quickly as possible, because if we got into these films in any more detail, this episode would probably go on for about 7 hours. So consider these reveals to be shout-outs of love. The real show, on the other hand, starts with our top 5s, where we will, in alphabetical order, reveal our 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and yes, number 1 favorite films of 2021 and open the floor for discussion for each film. And this episode is a little unusual because, shockingly and genuinely, I can't believe it, there are no overlaps on our list. There are some in our top 10s, but none in our top 5s. Out of 20 open slots, 20 films will be discussed. We have pretty different tastes, and that's been established in previous episodes, but this is a Talking Images first. I mean, hell, maybe we'll end up on a 7-hour episode after all. So, as we clearly have no time to waste here, let's get this show on the road. In alphabetical order as well, starting with you, Mathieu. What 5 films are you frustrated we won't be discussing in detail in today's episode?
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone. As it happens, my number 10 is a film we'll be talking about later on because it's Asghar Farhadi's A Hero, which is on someone else's top 5. It's what Farhadi usually does. It's great as usual, even though he's been accused of plagiarism, but whatever the case may be, the film is more than worth it. Then my number 9 is a film that maybe you could discuss not being a film. That's Bo Burnham's Netflix special Inside, which he made while being confined because of COVID. And it's this kind of all over the place musical that really embodies that particular period and is very creative. Then my number 8 is Jacques Audiard's latest film, Les Olympiades, or Paris 13th District, as it was called, which is this multiple stories crossing in Paris in black and white, a very sensitive film. And as we'll see, films with multiple stories is a bit of a theme this year, because my number 7 is also in that category. That's Ryusuke Hamaguchi's Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy, which has been discussed plenty. I guess I don't need to see too much about it. And then my number 6 is David Lowery's The Green Knight, which is this take at a medieval epic tale, which Lowery takes with this trademark, unique way of filming, as he showed in A Ghost Story. And yeah, The Green Knight is a great success. I wish I could talk about it more, but I guess we don't have the time. So I'll let Saul speak.
2021 gave us 2 great films from Norway, and neither of them is called The Worst Person in the World. One of them we'll get to much later because it's inside my top 5, but for my number 10 of the year, I've gone with the Norsk black comedy The Trip from Tommy Wirkola, a film with many twists and turns which are best left unspoiled, as a bickering couple's latest vacation unexpectedly brings them closer together. In my number 9 spot, I've got After Yang, which is the latest film from Ko Gunada, the director who brought us The Beautiful Columbus a few years earlier. In a nutshell, the film was about an android and past owner memories that may or may not be illegally stored in its system. The film looks gorgeous, as you'd expect from the director, with a lot of hyper-modern sets because it occurs in the near future, and all the android lifestyle brings to mind the excellent The Trouble with Being Born of a year earlier. For number 8, I've gone with, in inverted commas, the most controversial film of the year, the Palme d'Or winning Titane. It is one of those films in which it's got a second half, which is a lot more interesting than the first half, with Vincent Lindon providing one of the year's very best turns, as he bonds in unexpected ways with the female protagonist. But of course, the first half has all the body horror and personal identity elements that I just love in my movies. Only just missing out in number 7 is the recent Icelandic drama starring Nomi Rapace called Lamb. I had the good fortune of reading up very little about it, and while the first half hour of the film was a bit for me, as it basically just depicts farming life, the film soon begins dropping off left of field twists or turns, including one of the biggest WTF moments ever in the final 10 minutes. And it's just a really good look at what might happen if you get a little bit too close to your animals. And finally, in number 6, it pains me to leave out Kenneth Branagh's Belfast. Although I acknowledge the fact that I happened to see the film with a really great audience who were awing at every cute thing that happened, might have raised the film a bit in my estimation. I do think the film is terrifically well made, though, with a lot of daunting low camera angles that look up from the boy's point of view and so on, and some really great performances. And the film also has some really great movie versus reality dynamics, with one of the best high noon tributes you are ever likely to see anywhere. So those are 5 more films that I would thoroughly recommend, and I'll now hand over the mic to Tom to walk us through his number 6 to number 10 of the year.
Thanks, Sol. Some great picks from you and Matthew there. I wish we were discussing some of those choices at length, but we've got a lot of even better films to get into, so that's exciting. Now, I've seen a total of 150 films classed as 2021 releases, and it was tough to whittle them down to the top 10, but I'll start with The Last Duel, which is told from multiple perspectives. Ridley Scott's brooding medieval tale depicts the feud between two friends, which comes to a head when one is accused of raping the other's wife. It's a gritty and violent picture, and one of Scott's best in recent years. At number 9, it's Beyond the Infinite 2 Minute. Now, we talked about this at some length in our interview with Adam Terrell of Third Window Films in one of our earlier episodes. At number 8, now move over train to Busan. There's a new zombie extravaganza in town, and this time it's from Taiwan. The sadness ramps up the zombie action and depravity with an inventive twist on how the virus affects its victims, leading to a relentless assault of deeply disturbing violence that pushes the boundaries of transgressive horror. Number 7, it's another horror, Two Witches, which is a hilariously creepy anthology that heralds the arrival of a superb new talent in director Pierre Tsigaridis. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. He takes influence from 70s exploitation and the films of Argento to deliver a sublime modern take on witchcraft. Now, this lands on Shudder in October, and I can see it being a huge hit, so it's one to watch out for. And finally, at number 6, this is yet again another horror, and I was blown away by the audacity of this experimental, almost dialogue-free horror, a brooding sonic soundscape and impressive long takes that are separated into 3 distinct chapters about women who awake in a hospital to find they have lost either their sight, hearing, or ability to speak. This proved very divisive amongst the festival crowd, but if you're willing to take a punt on unconventional horror that favours mood and atmosphere over a narrative, then you will be rewarded with a deranged, nightmare-fueled head trip. So that's my numbers 10 to 6, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Chris has in his list of runners-up now.
Thanks, Tom. So on my number 10, we find Salome Yashi's stunning and evocative documentary Taming the Garden, which shows how Georgia's richest man, though mind you, he's never shown, is purchasing and slowly having workers dig up ancient, gigantic trees that are larger than houses. And she explores and shows how he builds entirely new roads just to transport these trees. This insanity of just seeing these enormous trees next to minuscule humans creates some truly magical and surreal images that are just out of this world. I mean, this film has to be seen to be believed. It's a hard sell, but it's just absolutely beautiful. On my number 9, we find Red Rocket, which we'll luckily discuss later on in the episode. My 8th favorite film of the year is Laura Vandel's Un Monde, which means a world, but is in English called Playground. Equally accurate, by the way. shot from the perspective of a child and never leaving the school. The playground in this beautiful, emotive film just truly feels like the world. You're just grounded there with the children, and it's just a phenomenal and unusual experience. My seventh choice would be the Norwegian horror drama The Innocents, which we'll also discuss later in this episode, actually. And my sixth favorite film of the year is Zero Fucks Given by Julie Lecostre and Emmanuel Mar, which follows a wayward and seemingly disengaged flight attendant for a low-cost airline traveling from location to location as it becomes increasingly apparent she's not just dealing with an existential crisis, but also a deep loss. The film is bold, often ugly, arguably bleakly satirical, as you just witnessed the kind of abuse she experiences both from her bosses, passengers, and just how completely lost she is in her own life, seemingly longing for something that's so clearly fabricated, these kind of influencer dreams, if you will. And I would love to speak more about this, but with that, we're finally here. The discussion can begin. So, Mathieu, what is your fifth favorite film of 2021?
My number 5 is a heist movie directed by someone whose best-known film by far is arguably the modern cornerstone of the genre, and yet this director keeps coming back to this genre, often successfully, and often finding new ways to explore it. I'm talking, of course, about Steven Soderbergh, and the film is No Sudden Move. In contrast with the glamour of Ocean's 11 and the postmodernist genius of its sequels, or to the outright comedy of Logan Lucky, No Sudden Move is a more somber film in which we follow Don Cheadle and Benicio del Toro play experienced gangsters put in a bad situation and trying to find the best angle possible to both survive and profit from it. Cheadle is great in the main role and really embodies the ethos of the film, that of a world where everything can turn at any moment, but if you're smart enough, you might just be able to turn it to your advantage. Ultimately, though, most of the people involved are really just pawns trying to eke out a very small piece of the pie. There's a certain mournfulness, a melancholy in this view of the world through the gangster subculture, which is what distinguishes it from Soderbergh's previous movies of this type and brings something new to the genre exercise. Soderbergh's current obsession with abnormally wide lenses is on full display here, as it was in films like High Flying Bird and Insane, and really underlines the idea of the characters always trying to be aware of what's going on all around them at all times to avoid nasty surprises, really involving the viewer into that paranoid mindset that's necessary to these guys. All that being said, it's also just a lot of fun, as this very rich cast is full of performers who revel in this type of character. And Dave Holmes also delivers yet another great score for yet another great Soderbergh gangster film.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there because No Sudden Move was the final film I saw when we were preparing for this episode, and it's just such a proper banger, if you will. It's funny, it's cheeky, it's just an all-around wild ride where you just see you cannot trust anyone. There's constant smaller twists. Everyone's out for themselves. Everyone's flawed, greedy, have bizarre morals. There's also an absolutely spectacular cameo in there I won't get into. What I will say on the lenses is that I don't think that was necessarily needed. This changing the scope a little bit, putting a wider lens above to create this distortion effect in a film that's also trying to be a bit retro. I just think that was extra. That didn't add anything for me, but everything else in this movie just comes together so well. It's all out genre, it's all out this kind of enjoyment of playing around with all of the tropes, all of the ideas of double crosses. It's just spot on. Also worth shouting out a really fun late performance from the late Ray Liotta. So many reasons to seek out this film.
I had a lot of fun with No Sudden Move. I'm really glad that Matteo brought it to my attention because it wasn't a film that I'd potentially have sought out were it not for his recommendation. Now, I think it's brilliant how many characters he's crammed into the film, but they're also memorable and stand out, even though some of them don't get too much screen time. There's a lot of the cast which you could imagine seeing a whole film devoted just to that individual, because the characterizations are just brilliant. The lens choice is unusual, but I wouldn't go so far as Chris as to say that it really detracts from the experience. If anything, it kind of makes it more memorable. And
I didn't say detract, it's just I didn't think it added anything.
Right, I see, Chris. Yeah, so you don't think it added. I thought it was a nice addition. It was unusual, and it seemed to suit the purpose of the film. But yeah, I had a lot of fun with this one, and it's definitely worth checking out if you're into gangster films with a lot of great dialogue.
Before Saul jumps in, I'll just say I do think Soderbergh is doing it just because he enjoys it. I mean, clearly his past few films have all featured that, but I do think, whether intentionally or not, it adds something to the film. Right? That again, that feeling of always something possibly going down in your like peripheral vision. So I think it ends up working for the film, but I definitely get Chris's point of view.
Steven Soderbergh is one of my favorite directors, so No Sudden Move was sort of on my watch list. Sort of was, sort of wasn't, because I wasn't very impressed with Laundromat, but I did really like Unsane. I loved Side Effects. So a lot of the films he's done recently have been really good. So I sort of have a slogan for myself, which is trust in Soderbergh, because with one or two exceptions, all of his films are in the good to very good to masterpiece range for me. In terms of No Sudden Move, it's not really towards the top of my Soderbergh list. I think it definitely starts out really well. I love the dynamics between Don Cheadle and Benicio del Toro at first, and how they sort of like bond after knowing each other for a few hours. They've got that scene where they drive out of the house and Del Toro whacks his head down onto Cheadle's lap to make sure that people aren't seeing him as he's driving past, because Cheadle's meant to have whacked him. And I thought this is going to be a really interesting film to see how the relationship develops between these two characters. So I thought there's going to be some really interesting character dynamics. Because what I love so much about the Oceans films is not so much that they're stylish heist films, but they're really great character pieces. I can't really think of any other franchise out there which has got 11 main characters, and all of them are fleshed out in so much depth as distinct individuals over the course of 3 films. Now, to my disappointment, but it's probably my own perception, but to my disappointment, the film didn't really go down that pathway of further fleshing out these relationships. As it goes on, we find out more about different other characters in there, and there are a lot of big names popping up in cameos, including an unrecognizable Brendan Fraser. I had no idea that it was him. There's another one which is a bit more of a surprise cameo, which Chris avoided mentioning, so I'll avoid mentioning it also, but I had to stare at him and go, no, I'm pretty sure it is him, and then actually check up in Letterboxd that it was him, and that I wasn't just imagining it. So there are some really great performances in there. It's a really well done film. I just wasn't expecting it to go in a slightly different direction and be more character based, whereas it's more about, this document everybody's after. And then regarding the document, for most of the film, it really felt like a MacGuffin for me. And we don't really realize during the course of the film what the document is. I mean, there's a couple of characters that look at it and discuss it, but it's really only in the end credits. There's a couple of title cards that tell us about the historical importance of what they're after, because the film's set in the late 50s, early 60s, and it actually is something important, but we don't really find that out until the very end. So for most of it, for me, it was a bit of a MacGuffin thriller, and Hitchcock made some great MacGuffin thrillers, so that's fine. But probably for me, that's the difference for it being a second tier rather than a top tier Soderbergh film for me. As usual for Soderbergh, the film looks gorgeous. I had no problem with the aspect ratio. I looked it up, and it's 2:16:1, and standard ultra widescreen is 2:35:1. So it's not really a very big difference. There is one film, I can't think of a title offhand. I think it was a Latin American film that was shot in 2:1. So, twice as long one way to the other way, and that was very distracting. But yeah, the 2:16 wasn't really to me that noticeable. I mean, there were times where I was like, oh, this does seem super wide, but it didn't stand out to me that often. A bit different to Unsane. But in Unsane, I think it's for a reason. I think it really furthered it with Unsane because you really had that secret camera hidden footage recording feel to it. So I thought that was absolutely awesome, the aspect ratio. But yeah, for me, in No Sudden Move, it didn't really play that much into it. Although I like what Mature said about how it sort of gives that idea of this world where everybody has to look out for everything and there's danger everywhere and you have to always be on the lookout. But I just love how the way Soderbergh keeps experimenting with his films. You know, he's always trying something new, always trying something different. It doesn't have the super saturated colors that I love so much because that's what Soderbergh does the best. But, you know, it's still a very different looking film. And yeah, it is just really well accomplished overall. It just wasn't what I was hoping going into it.
Fair enough, Sol. Just a note on the distortion effect. So what Soderbergh did was that he placed a wider lens on top of a large camera, so that was, I think, 1.5 times larger than the format was designed for. And then he originally shot it for 2:40:1, and then he changed it to 2:16:1 later because the distortion effect originally was too extreme, that he felt it was distracting. So it's a very interesting process. The images look intriguing, and I think, like you said, it's always fun when he experiments like that. I would say that with the MacGuffin, I actually think that it tied in more with the film than you did. I think that, you know, slowly over the course of the film, you start realizing who's pulling the strings, who's relevant, who the top dogs are, and you realize that there's actually some social critique and historical critique, and also a little bit of a history lesson in there that end up tying into antitrust laws, so a bit of a semi-moral message, which I hadn't expected in such a film that's essentially all about amoral characters. So there's a bit of a duality there. I think the fun works. I'm not sure if the messaging works, but it's a really interesting choice for Soderbergh to do. So definitely not a negative for me.
Moving on to my number 5 of the year, I get very wary whenever I hear a new Pedro Almodovar film getting bandied about as being his best film since Volver or his best film since All About My Mother. That's what many people were saying about Giulietta when it came out, and a lot of people were saying similar things about Pain and Glory. The sticking point for me is that The Skin I Live In is actually my favorite Almodovar film, bar none. So when I heard yet again that Parallel Mothers was being cited as his best film since Volver, I really had my doubts. Well, it's not better than The Skin I Live In, but it is certainly on a similar level to Volver for me. And of course, this is yet another Penelope Cruz starring Almodovar effort. So my number 5 is Parallel Mothers. The plot involves an unmarried photographer who comes to suspect that the hospital made a mistake with her baby. It's an emotionally charged drama, and Cruz is really compelling to watch, in particular when she's faced with some hard decisions upon learning more than one difficult truth, which I don't know if we'll get into for fear of spoilers. Indeed, while the film initially seems to be heading down the pathway of a certain Hirokazu Kurita movie, which again I don't know if I should mention for fear of spoilers, what we actually get instead is something much more complex and twisted in the most fascinating possible way. One thing I think I should mention, because I don't know if any of my co-hosts had the same experience as me, I actually worked out what had happened at the hospital long before she did. Maybe I've just got an eye for faces. I mean, the film cuts to the next shot with her baby, and I was already thinking, wait, to myself. So I don't know if that was intentional, whether we're meant to be more included than she was, but I was already suspecting that. So that was interesting when things do arise. I'm trying to be as vague as possible. Whatever the case, this is an extremely complex and involving movie, and I was absolutely stunned when it didn't win the Goya Award for Best Spanish Film, but we will come to that later.
So I had slightly mixed emotion about Parallel Mothers. I did actually really like it. Parallel Mother is always enjoyable, but it felt like a film which head was just all over the place. So, I mean, you present the film as being about this mother who starts to suspect that her child might not be hers, and that is probably a more accurate description of the film. But the first 10 minutes is focused on fascism and the imprint fascism made in Spanish history, the Civil War, the mass graves, and that's kind of where it goes back to later on as well. And it feels like it's just this film of several minds. It wants to comment on the fascist history of Spain, it wants to comment on these atrocities, but then instead we get a lot of sex, a lot of cheating. Of course, it's Pedro Almodovar, but still. And it seems to forget what it's about. It seems to just forget itself where it is. Like, it has a beginning and an end that ties together. It has a middle that ties together. And it was a very odd choice for me. It's like Pedro Almodovar wanted to remind people that Spain was a dictatorship and that a lot of people were murdered, and then he just had to lure people in with sex. That's kind of how I felt. But it's a good film, it's really well acted, good chemistry, a lot of twists, but yeah, in fact, it just felt so disconnected to me that I couldn't quite call it great or among one of the best Almodovars.
I'm not much of an Almodovar fan, so I'm really glad that Sol picked this, as otherwise I probably would have never had the inclination to seek it out. I thought the central storyline revolving around the two mothers was brilliant, riveting throughout, and I wasn't sure what direction it was going to go, so I was pleasantly surprised by how it unfolds. Now, I did feel that the historical commentary wasn't as impactful as the main plot to the protagonist. Like Chris said, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. Those two elements weren't really tied together as well as they could be, and that is kind of what holds it back from being a favourite for me, but it's still a very good film nonetheless, and I would recommend this to anyone who's intrigued by what we've said about it so far.
So I do find it interesting, Chris, that you describe this film as being a film of three parts that are entirely connected to each other, because considering what your number one is, but I guess we'll get back to that later. Yeah, but Madres Paralelas is an Almodovar film. It's what you expect, except, as you guys mentioned, it's a little more political. I kind of agree that the two threads are not connected in the most elegant way, but I still think it adds something to his films, which tend to get a little samey after a while. And so I think I enjoyed this aspect of it, right? Because it was something a little different. And one thing I want to mention is Penelope Cruz, of course, is always really good in Almodovar films. But Milena Smith, who plays the other main character, she is wonderful. I did not know her at all, and I was very impressed by her. She's basically my favorite supporting performance, if you can call it that, of the year. And yeah, I really wanted to highlight her. I think she's particularly great in this film.
So very interesting to hear you guys talk about Parallel Mothers and the historical part of it. I would probably actually agree that, especially the way that its book ended with the archaeological digs, so all the fascism and mass graves pops up at the beginning and pops up again at the end. I found that a lot less compelling than the main plot involving Penelope Cruz and the babies. So I'd agree with that, although I'd say I can see there is some purpose in there. Almodovar is trying to say something about truths and facts and secrets that get buried, and the same thing could have also happened with the babies. So I can see there's a little bit of something in there about things that aren't said and things that sort of get swept under the carpet, and there's some parallel he's trying to make. Parallel, there's a bit of a pun in there. I don't think it's especially elegant, and that'll probably be why it's not a top tier Almodovar film. So I'll rate a few films a bit higher than that, but I think it's a really decent second tier Almodovar effort, and I was blown away by Penelope Cruz's performance. I've never seen her, so down to earth and so vulnerable. I mean, she's a stunning looking woman, so to really actually see her completely break down, I can't really recall anything offhand that's really drawn me in quite that much. The other shout out I do want to give is to the film's amazing music score, which also got an Oscar nomination, in addition to Penelope Cruz. Although a lot of Almodovar's films have amazing music, so that's probably no surprise.
So my number 5 film of the year is none other than Red Rocket by Sean Baker. Now, Sean Baker has made a name for himself through his strong character-driven dramas that usually focus on the less fortunate and often employ non-actors or lesser-known actors. His latest outing, Red Rocket, introduces us to an absolute slimeball in Mikey Saber, a washed-up porn star who returns to his hometown after quitting the industry. He moves in with his ex-wife and mother-in-law and attempts to seduce a girl far too young for him while stealing marijuana to make ends meet. Somehow, through Baker's impressive direction and Simon Rex's exceptional performance as the charismatic Mikey Sabre, we begin to root for this creep, despite his downright manipulative and selfish ways. The situations Mikey finds himself in are often humorous, and it is an absolute blast seeing how he manages to squirm out of trouble again and again, though he does suffer a number of punishing setbacks along the way. This is a brilliant black comedy that is, in my opinion at least, Sean Baker's best work yet, with an absolutely star-making turn from Simon Rex. Its vulgarity does get quite close to the bone at times, so I'd be careful who you watch it with, though I suppose it goes without saying, no one is mad enough to watch a film about an ex-porn star with their mum, are they?
Yeah, it's quite interesting to hear Tom talk about being careful who you see the film with, because I actually saw Red Rocket as an in-flight movie. When it came up, it was one of the... Yeah, look, it came up as, a pick there. There were a few things playing, none of which looked particularly interesting. I'm like, that's that Sean Baker film that Tom's been talking about. I sort of look around because I know that it's about a porn star, and but it's set to play in the little iPad in the airplane chair, and I'm like, whatever, I'll sit down to watch it. And most of it's pretty good, but there was some parts from sort of like looking around and like everybody's focused on what they're doing themselves, whatever, so nobody paid attention to what I was watching. But yeah, there's definitely some shots in there. Whereas if I had somebody else who was paying attention looking on, especially with one close up that he does, that would be a bit of an uncomfortable film to watch. But yeah, that's probably one of the weirdest films I've seen as an in-flight movie. Going on a little bit more about the film, Red Rocket was a movie which I approached with some trepidation. I loved Sean Baker's Starlet and Tangerine. However, the Florida Project really rubbed me the wrong way with its obnoxious child characters and championing of the terrible mothering skills of one of the most grating human beings ever portrayed on screen. Now, Red Rocket also features some characters that are not 100% likable, but like Tom said, they actually are really interesting to follow around there. They've got a bit more humanity, and whether it be how Simon Rex boyishly rides his bike or his co-star's girlish flirty mannerisms, the characters come with quite a bit of charm beyond the very questionable things that they do. So in many ways, I found this was nicely close to the Starlet. What I really liked about Red Rocket was the relationship between the two main characters. So you've got Mikey, the porn star, and you've got Strawberry or Rayleigh, who works at a donut shop. And it's sort of questionable, are they falling for each other? Are they falling in love? He does keep talking about wanting to use her and trying to entice her into the porn industry because he sees her as a way of getting his career back on path if he can become her agent, become a promoter. So he's manipulating her, but then she's also manipulating him. I mean, she's being really flirty with a guy who's old enough to be her dad, but he also says he's got all these connections. So she also sees it as an in for her that she could maybe try and get to Hollywood if she be really snug with him. So that's really what kept me going along with the film. I was trying to work out, are these characters falling in love? Is she playing him along? Is he playing him along? The whole thing was incredibly interesting to watch, aside for all the full frontal nudity, which really came out of nowhere at times. So yeah, really interesting film. I didn't really buy into the Trump-Clinton 2016 backdrop. That just felt completely random to me, but somebody else might be able to comment on that. But yeah, look, the film has one hell of an ending, and I would recommend watching it, although probably not on an aeroplane like I did with tons of other people around.
Yeah, that does not sound ideal. I mean, I don't even enjoy watching films on airplanes to begin with, and yeah, that would not have been very good fit. So, Red Rocket was on my top 10. I actually, unlike you, Saul, I really love the Florida Project. And I didn't mind obnoxious children and all. I think the cinematic techniques they used there to kind of get us into those children's world, present this dirty, crazy world, those were just absolutely wonderful to me. And he kind of did something similar here, though a bit more restraint compared to that previous effort. I will also give absolute credit for making NSYNC's Bye 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 fit in so well. I think it's used 3 or 4 times at really important moments in the film and with very different contexts and intentions. So Red Rocket, it's so dirty, it's so slimy, it's ugly, it shows its kind of backside to America a little bit, if you will. And unlike Tom, I never started rooting for Mikey. I mean, he is just an absolute slime ball, and we don't really swear in this podcast. I'm trying to find another word for, I guess it's a con artist, is the best way of putting it. He's trying to con everyone around him. He's always trying to one-up them. He's always talking out of his own ass. He's bragging. He's in his own head. He's just, especially as the film continues, he just spirals out of control in a way, and he has this grand ideas of himself. And I think that's part of the commentary Sean Baker is doing with the tie-ins with the presidential election and Trump, that he's kind of seeing a parallel between this con artist and Trump, and saying Trump is a similar kind of slimeball. Like that's probably the connection he's making. But I mean, I don't think you need that at all, because Simon Rex delivers a performance you never think this guy would be capable of doing. I probably mark him down as one of the best performers of the year. It's insane he was not nominated for an Oscar, because this creepy slimeball lusting after a 17-year-old girl, trying to get into the pants of his ex-wife, having this other woman on the side, dealing drugs because he can't find another job, sneaking around the rules for how he's meant to be dealing drugs from the crime family, if you will. It's so dirty, it's so ugly. He's so dirty and ugly in so many ways, but it's also fun. It's fun in how slimy it is and immoral it all is. And you just get spellbound into this con, essentially. Can he pull it all off? It's just a full-on character study. It's arguably a study of a type of time, a type of character, if you will, as well. And it delivers, in my opinion, on almost every single front. Some of the unprofessional actors, especially the mother of the ex-wife, can be a little bit grating, but the film as a whole just really works. Those shots of him riding around on the bike, his kind of fall into this type of poverty, and how he still has that ability to con in him. I think that's just absolutely spectacular to watch. And talking about connections, a film that stress you as well, it really ties in with stress. In some ways it's connected. I would say it's a different take on, for instance, Uncut Gems, where you also have this character who's just completely full of himself, trying to trick everyone around him to get what he wants, and it just not necessarily panning out for him. So just really wonderful effort, and I'm really happy you picked it, Tom.
It's brilliant to hear your thoughts on the film, Chris. I really like the parallels you draw between the Trump and Mikey there, and that just makes me really squirm thinking that I was kind of rooting for Mikey in parts of the film now that you've elaborated on that. I need to watch it again with that in mind. But I'm really glad that you loved this one. I think everyone that I've recommended it to has enjoyed it. And it's just a great black comedy. There's so much love there. The situations that happen during the film, so unexpected. And there's some really, really funny stuff in there, and it goes to some dark places. And I had a lot of fun with it.
Well, I think it's always hard to root against the protagonist. Right? Hitchcock kind of weaponized that in a bunch of films, and I think Sean Baker does it here as well. He's absolutely a terrible person, but he is the protagonist. You just kind of can't help but want him to succeed, just for the story to advance, in a sense. I am very curious about this notion that Saul has, that taking someone's money, taking money that is not yours, is different from stealing. But I think we can get back to that a little later, maybe with another film. Red Rocket, it's funny that this comes right after the Almodovar film, because I think similarly, it's just Sean Baker doing what he does. He's exploring working class America with a lot of humor, a lot of honesty, and getting really good performances out of kind of unknown actors. I mean, I think Simon Rex has done other things, but I certainly didn't know him, and I agree with Chris. He's great here. I also think the young actress is excellent. I prefer the Florida Project myself, like Chris, but yet another very, very strong film from Sean Baker.
I agree. Simon Rex should be a pathetic character on the surface, but yeah, I couldn't help but love him. He's just got so much energy in it. He's got like this way where he does this like little dance, whatever, when he finds out he's got off scot-free, and the neighbor like looks at him and stares at him like, why is this 40-year-old man dancing like a 15-year-old kid? The way he rides his bike with his hands going up in the air, the way he keeps telling everybody, get out your iPhone, look me up or whatever. Yeah, that's me. He's just got so much energy in there, and just compared to, I guess, like his ex-wife, who's always slouching down the couch, and her mother, he's just the brightest spark in the film, and I guess that's why I couldn't help but I don't just love him, but I like him a lot as a character. And I guess maybe you could say similarly about Trump or whatever. He's got so much personality that a lot of people can't help but cling on to that. So I guess that parallel does make it quite interesting. But I guess when I was watching it with all the 2016 stuff going on in the background, I'm going, wait, did Sean Baker write this before Florida Project? Because Florida Project came out in 2017 and this movie's set in 2016. But I guess it doesn't really matter that much at the end of the day because there's so much going on there with the relationship between the two characters and trying to work out, is Strawberry manipulating Mikey? Is Mike manipulating her? Or are they both actually falling in love with each other?
Yeah, and just to say, I completely agree with you there, Solon. While he's a speakable slimeball character, he is a lot of fun to watch. Like the way he tries to scam everyone around him is it's just brilliant to watch. So yeah, definitely, like you will be drawn into his antics and cons. Definitely, no doubt about it. Moving to my fifth favorite film of 2021, we find Florence Miai's The Crossing, which is a grim and despairing refugee drama told almost as a fairy tale, with striking animation that can change from bright and innocent to grotesque in seconds. I think it's the only animated film we will actually be talking about here today, and let me just say, the animation is incredible. The film is done by oil painting on glass, a process that's so slow that it is essentially never done on features. The colors are so bold and vibrant. It feels out of this world, and it's an animation style you just won't see very often. The story itself is inspired by the life of the director's grandmother, but modernized a little bit and placed in a fictional Eastern European country where we follow young children as they try to make it to safety during wartime. Corruption and violence is all around them, and hope can rarely be found. All the same, our lead, Kiona, keeps her perseverance and documents her journey with sketches of the people she meets on her path. These sketches are our way into the world in a way, as the older Kiona flips through them, and it actually grounds the story and makes it feel more intimate and real, as the animation and narrative almost play with fantasy, or rather memory imagination, through this artistic lens. You kind of feel like this is Kiona's art. This is how she remembers or wants to remember or has to remember these events. And this feeling that the animation is part of the story and art of Kiona herself, making what we see, both her recollections, how she expresses the sadness of what she went through, makes everything feel so much grander. The narrative itself is, in many ways, really simple, but everything else is just stunningly done, and it's why I just absolutely love this film.
Yeah, so La Traversée, as you mentioned, is a pretty gorgeous film to look at. The glass animation has this very unique style, which just gorgeous, at least as executed here. One interesting thing about this film is you mentioned it was inspired by the director's grandmother, and so it takes place in a fictional continent that is very similar to Eastern Europe, right, in how it feels like. And back when this came out, when I saw it, it felt relevant because it was talking about refugees, right? And so you obviously think about refugees coming from the Middle East. And now, obviously, Eastern Europe is also a place where this is happening. So it's kind of doubly relevant, I suppose. But yeah, I have to agree with everything Chris is saying. I had forgotten that it ended with a bit of a meta touch, which of course is like the +1 star for Chris, as always. But yeah, it does work quite well, I think. I think it does add a lot of emotional resonance, I think, to a film that, because it has kind of fictional setting, by necessity can be a bit vague at times. And I think that weirdly helps ground it, even though it's theoretically artificial.
Now, I admired the animation that was used in The Crossing, though it didn't really speak to me in the way that you seem to connect with it, Chris. It was nicely done and it suited the story, but it didn't really draw me in. I didn't find it particularly mesmerising or anything like that. The story, on the other hand, I thought it was well done. It's a poignant tale. Family of refugees seeking safety as they flee from danger. And as Matthew said, it feels very topical at the moment, and this certainly adds to the emotional impact of the story. I didn't really like the fact that it took place in a fictional continent. It took me a while to kind of cotton on that was what the filmmaker was going for. At first I was thinking, where is this actually meant to be set? Before, I realised that it's just fictional. And I thought it would have been more powerful if they had have, stuck to the facts. But as it is, it's still an incredibly personal film, with a lot of heart and effort that's gone into it. So I would recommend it for people who are interested in animations that offer something a little different.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that. I think that may mean this is my most appreciated film of these 5 films we'll be talking about. Let's see. And this actually brings us on to our 4th favorite films of 2021. And once again, starting with you, Mathieu, what is your number 4 pick?
My number 4 is The French Dispatch. And watching this is probably the most giddy I've been in the theater all year. It's a film that made me smile the most, basically. In other words, it was pure cinematic pleasure for me. Obviously, Wes Anderson's aesthetic is something you either enjoy or you don't, but it's not like I love all of his movies. So why did this one make me so happy? I think people often have trouble engaging emotionally with his films, and that's where The French Dispatch worked for me, in part because of its anthology format, actually. With an anthology film, you're always trying to connect the dots, right? To understand why all of this belongs in the same film. Obviously, this is Anderson's homage to The New Yorker and a certain semi-fantasized version of Paris. But more broadly, I think it reflects an actually pretty bleak vision of the world where violence and darkness are always lurking in the corner. But what Anderson focuses in is what we find in life to elevate ourselves out of that mire in a way, right? It might be painting for a very violent man who finds it later in life. It might be cooking, it might be posing, it might be eating, it might be love, it might be rebellion. And finally, of course, it might be writing about all of those things. It's a love letter to the art of enjoying life, despite all of the reasons there are not to. And I think that duality is what makes this particular film work for me. And the third segment in particular seems to me like the most perfect distillation of everything I love about Anderson's work, complete with one of Alexandre Desplat's best scores. I think, his best since Grand Budapest Hotel for me in terms of combining all of that he does best. And the anthology format, which I think posed problems for a lot of people, I think actually serves this film quite well.
I love how you describe the film as just providing visual pleasure, Matthew, because that's pretty much what Wes Anderson always does. And in this film, perhaps more so than ever, I mean, he's just diving into both black and white color. He's doing these glorious sequences in every which way you can imagine. He's borrowing a lot from classic 60s aesthetics from all of the great masters of Europe, particularly France. And the film is just so much fun. I agree with you that anthology setup works really well here. And like, despite spending so little time with each of these characters, essentially, due to just having this enormous cast, as he always does these days, essentially every character gets to shine, even if they're on screen for like 2 minutes, 3 minutes. You get something from that character or actor, and they really deliver. It's massive, it's epic, it plays around with form as well, and as you know, that's one of the things that generally gets me engaged the most, so the fact that the film is set up as if you were watching a magazine, that's phenomenal. It doesn't quite follow through with that to the rigorous extent I would probably have liked, but it's such a cool idea. And also the way it brings in these different writer personas, and all this flourish and this enjoyment of the writing styles and the way of presenting situations and their sarcasm, irony, general comedy, the way they present everything. It all ties together. It's a great film and a great pick.
I have to be a little bit of a contrarian here. No, I do love Wes Anderson films, but felt like The French Dispatch was one of his weakest efforts in recent years. A big fan of his aesthetic and his visual style, and he always gets brilliant performances from his cast, but something just didn't feel right with The French Dispatch. It didn't all click for me. The first two segments were certainly enjoyable, but the third segment didn't work for me at all. And it's sad to say, but I found myself switching off, and I can't really put my finger on what it was that didn't work for me. It just almost feels like his style is tired, and I'm not really as excited about his next film as I was for the French Dispatch. But I'm certainly glad that Matthew and Chris enjoyed it, because there is a lot in there to love, but it just wasn't one that worked for me, sadly.
To just even things out, I'm actually coming from a similar page to Tom. So The French Dispatch really feels like a film that's tailor-made by Wes Anderson for Wes Anderson fans. And I'm not a Wes Anderson fan. He has only made 2 genuinely great films for my money. This is not one of them, and I've seen them all. In fact, it seems the more that I explore Anderson as a filmmaker, the less I like him. His filmmaking style is so artificial that I really find myself being able to relate to his characters. That's something which Mature said before about the emotional involvement. Part of his artifice comes from his trademark storybook structure, introductions, title cards, chapter titles, etc., the whole anthology style, which is very much rife in The French Dispatch. Story immersion was just really highly difficult for me because everything was calling attention to itself. The real killer for me about the film, though, which I don't think anybody's mentioned so far, was the framing. Anderson absolutely loves symmetry, and The French Dispatch is by far his most symmetrical movie to date, to the point of utter distraction. There is never anything natural where the characters are framed or move about in shot. The whole thing seems very composed. It always feels highly artificial. And while I suppose it can be argued that it's meant to signify the artifice in the articles that we see play out, just watching it just felt more bizarre rather than remarkable to me. So unfortunately, I have to be a bit more dissenting than Tom. He said it's probably one of Anderson's weakest. I'd say it probably is his weakest film to date. And likewise, I have even less interest in seeing his next one than I did in seeing this one after the disappointment of his last 2 very massively hyped up films.
Okay, so I'm curious now, Saul. What are the 2 Wes Anderson films you do love?
So the 2 that I'd say are generally great are Moonrise Kingdom and Fantastic Mr. Fox. Fantastic Mr. Fox, I think, really benefits from the stop motion animation style, which I think works really well for Anderson and works better in Fantastic Mr. Fox than Isle of Dogs, because that one didn't do much for me either. Although I think also it comes down to the Roald Dahl source material, works really well with what Anderson's doing. And Moonrise Kingdom is just a great tale, a great coming of age tale involving 2 kids acting a bit more like adults. It's I don't know, it's just the only real Anderson film where I really felt the magic is there. So Moonrise Kingdom is by far my favorite from him. Fantastic Mr. Fox was really good. The rest of them range from good to pretty average in my books.
Okay. I just want to get back just for a second to the anthology thing, because I think Wes Anderson is not at his best when he's fleshing out characters. Sometimes he can do it, but it's not his best quality. And that's the reason for me that French Dispatch worked so well, is because his unique visual style is great at establishing someone very quickly. And to me, that's why the anthology really works well, because you know very quickly what Léa Seydoux is about in that first segment, right? And so the segment lasts for 35 minutes, and you don't really need more from that character. So I just wanted to explain what I meant by the anthology structure working really well, aside from the obvious, symmetry and ability to do a bunch of different things, which is obviously what he loves.
I'll probably agree that deep character portraits aren't really what you expect from an Anderson film, and maybe that's part of why I find it difficult to engage with his films in general. Moonrise Kingdom is quite different in that regard, or that was co-written by Roman Coppola, so I don't know if that had any influence in there. I haven't checked offhand who Wes Anderson's other co-writers are in other films, although I know Royal Tenenbaums was with Owen Wilson. So yeah, look, I agree with that. In terms of characters, yeah, he's not really interested in doing deep character studies. I agree that's not really what he's going for as a filmmaker. But I guess just besides that, I just find his films annoying. I don't know if that's the best word to describe it, but just the way that everything is done to be symmetrical and everything has to be structured in this way, it creates a very high level of artificiality, which I guess does sort of work, like I said, with the newspaper stories thematically. But in terms of me trying to get involved in a film, I mean, I guess it depends whether you find symmetry to be beautiful or not. And I guess symmetry can be beautiful, but then you think of things like the rule of thirds. I think some of the more interesting photographs that I've seen out there, interesting films out there, are ones that actually aren't symmetric, ones that aren't actually perfectly structured, but actually have those bumps along the way.
Well, I, for one, really enjoy Wes Anderson's essentially unique style at this point. It's instantly recognizable, and even though his style might get more and more amplified now, because I do think that the French Dispatch could be described as everything Wes Anderson does, just more of it. I don't mind that, and I don't mind if he tries to go for even more next time, because I am one of those Wes Anderson fans this film is probably tailored for. Though I will say, while I did think it was great, it is one of the Wes Anderson films I think is the least great. So it would probably be close to the bottom list of my Wes Anderson ranking, just to drop that out there. So if you're not a Wes Anderson fan, maybe not the film for you, or at least maybe not the first film of his you should try. I also slightly disagree in terms of larger characters. Obviously, he's done a lot of films focused on the same characters more or less from start to finish. More recently, Ralph Fiennes as Gustav H. in the Grand Budapest Hotel. I think that was a phenomenal performance and character. Obviously, he doesn't do deep character portrait because he's a humorist and a stylist, but I do think he can actually create great characters and spend a lot of time with them. That said, let's move on to your number 4 favorite film of the year, Saul.
Earlier on, I mentioned that I was stunned to learn that Parallel Mothers didn't win the Gore Award for Best Spanish Film of 2021. It was beaten by a comedy called The Good Boss, starring Javier Bardem. Knowing that it had beaten Parallel Mothers, I was very skeptical when I sat down to watch The Good Boss, but much to my surprise, I liked it more, and it is in fact my number 4 film of the year for this podcast. It's about a man who works at a scales factory. He's the boss there, and he's absolutely obsessed with winning this industry award for excellence. And he ends up going to extraordinary measures over the course of a week in order to ensure success in getting this award. The film is very much powered by Bud's commanding lead performance. He quickly establishes himself as very horrible and as a very two-faced human being, but on the other hand, he's so charming and he's so boyishly obsessed with winning that I guess, like Simon Rex in Red Rocket, it's really hard not to root for him with all his energy and enthusiasm. As a narrative, the film is a bit slow to begin with because it focuses on a few different subplots, whereas the funniest one involves a former employee who camps outside his building in protest, and I would have, I guess, liked to see that build up a little bit more. But, as the film progressed, things get more and more crazy, and all the subplots actually nicely tie together and overlap in a way that appears balanced on the surface, but as Bardem himself states, sometimes it's necessary to trick the scale in order to get it right.
I think that's a really good description of the characters, and I love that you compare it to Simon Rex in Red Rocket as well. This is actually one of the biggest overlaps between all of our lists is this focus on characters that essentially try to con people around them or trick people around them and are so obsessed with their own visions and ideas of who they should be and what they want that they forget certain things, overlook certain things, and get in trouble. There's going to be a lot more of those films coming up in our lists as well. So a really interesting thing happening here in 2021. I will absolutely agree that David Bardem is great in this film. He has this kind of idea where he's obviously constantly calls everyone around him his children. He's trying to present this idea that he is this, like the title says, this good boss, but he's also this person who tries to sleep with all of his interns, who is only out for himself and will get involved in everyone's private lives if it means just getting an award, for instance. He'll just do absolutely terrible things. It's a fun, cheeky, dark comedy, a morality play in many ways. That's just a fun ride from beginning to end. It's a bit more down to earth than some of the more extreme versions of this. We'll talk about a little bit later, and that which we've covered already, for instance, with Red Rocket. But it's just a thoroughly fun, sly, and darkly humorous film that I think most people will enjoy.
It's really great to hear a positive take on The Good Boss, Chris, because the film that I haven't really heard much said about on the internet so far, other than people disparaging it because it beat Parallel Mothers at the Goya Awards. But it is really a fantastic film. It's a bit unpredictable, I think. I mean, you could sort of get an idea about where it's heading, but the way different things spiral out of control happen in ways that you might not suspect. And you have some really, interesting scenes, like the security guards end up having coffee, which is made by the guy who's parked outside his building in protest, and Bardem, calls him a traitor for having his cup of coffee. And yeah, the way that Bardem's manipulating everybody, including all his interns, is really complex and interesting. And then it all comes back to bite him a bit towards the end without spoiling it too much. And yet he still manages to, weed his way out of there.
The security guard adds so much fun to the film, especially when, this protester outside is throwing these, chanting all of these rants, and the security guard is there, commenting on how it rhymes and doesn't rhyme, kind of like subtly dropping hints. And you have this kind of back and forth between them, but for so much of the film, it's just really hilarious.
Yeah, no, he was a great supporting character to have in there. The only other thing I was going to mention is just the ending of the film still really stuck with me. There's a point at the end, without revealing too much, where he's standing in silence next to another character who he's wronged, and he's about to talk, and you expect him to say something, but he doesn't. He really actually stays completely in character. So I don't want to spoil it too much, but that ending really got to me, because that's when I was expecting things to turn around, but they don't, because, that's the sort of character who he is.
The Good Boss is the only film that's been discussed today that I haven't seen, unfortunately. It's yet to have a release in the UK, but it's coming out in a few weeks, so it's going to be high up on my watch list. For my number 4 film, I've picked Old Henry. Now, Old Henry proves that there is still life in the Western, with a riveting story about a farmer with a shrouded past who gets caught up in trouble when he encounters a wounded man not far from his estate. Henry lives alone with his son, and the father-son relationship in the film adds a surprising amount of emotion to the film, particularly with Henry's protective nature, struggling to come to terms with his son's transition into a young man. It features an exceptional central performance from Tim Blake Nelson as the world-weary protagonist, whose brooding dialogue makes you feel like a pistol could go off at any moment. For the most part, it's a brooding and atmospheric western with a stirring soundtrack that heightens the tension as we inch closer to the inevitable showdown. Now, Old Henry doesn't really bring anything new to the genre, but what it does incredibly well. The violence is gritty and graphic in parts, and the jaw-dropping finale delivers a memorable, action-packed sequence that leaves you on the edge of your seat. I think that Old Henry would potentially work just as well if it scrapped some of the mythos around its central character. Though this is a small gripe, and I feel that this aspect of the storytelling is probably likely to hit the sweet spot for most Western fans.
Yeah, I quite enjoyed Old Henry. It's probably one of my lesser favorites from the films we'll be discussing today, but it's a lot of fun. Like you said, Tim Blake Nelson is great in it, and there's just so much genre, pulpy fun here. It also ties in with this previous films we were talking about, where you have characters kind of looking out for themselves, trying to one-up each other, having secrets other people don't know about, and this all coming out in some explosion action ways. I think it's funny that it's marked as an action film because most of it is quite down to earth. It's mainly suspense building up, dialogue. You have an idea of where it will go, but not 100% sure exactly where it will go and who's who. But it does have some big shootouts. It really delivers on the action when it comes. And like Tom said, it has pretty much everything a Western fan would be looking for. It really just feels like one of those classic Western tales. So yes, very interesting pick, Tom. And I think you're right that it does show that there's still life in the Western, which a few films have done recently.
Old Henry was quite an interesting film to watch because throughout the movie, I kept getting hints of something along the lines of a history of violence with regards to Nelson's character. But what exactly that was isn't actually revealed until the last 20 minutes. And afterwards, I was thinking about it, I was thinking the film actually might have been more dynamic if that was revealed earlier on. So, I mean, in A History of Violence, it's revealed, I guess, around halfway in. And with the reveal kept towards the end of the movie, it really felt to be a bit of a gotcha twist. I know Tom said the movie would work just as effectively without it in there, but I think having that reveal in there does shine a very different everything. So, yeah, I just thought it was very interesting for that to just be knocked in at the end. But either way, the final third of the film was absolutely electric. As already been mentioned, the action is amazing. The tension really wraps up in the final half hour, especially as Tim Blake Nelson's character is forced to choose sides because a lot of the film is about his uncertainty because we've got the injured man and we've got the leader of the posse, and they're both claiming to be a sheriff. And it's up to the Tim Blake Nelson character, the old Henry, to try and work out who's telling the truth and who's lying. So, there is quite an interesting mystery in there. But yeah, when he's actually forced to choose sides in the final half hour, I think that's where it got really interesting. So for me, the film ended on a high note. I was liking the stuff of it much more than the first half. Though overall, I was still scratching my head about that reveal and thinking how different the film might be if it was dropped, say, halfway in rather than saved until that final quarter of the movie.
It's funny you say that, Saul, because I think the exact reverse in that, to me, the reveal, to me, did not change anything to the point that I'm not sure why it was even there. Because we know that this character has, let's say, a dark past, right? That he's reformed in some way. That's pretty clear. And yeah, again, I don't know what the specificity of this reveal adds aside from, I guess, a surprise of some sort. Anyway, sadly, I was not a fan of this film. I think it has the issue that I have with a lot of film that it's really very pulpy if you look at what's going on and how the people behaved, which is in very incoherent ways just because it's a spectacle, which is fine. But the film aesthetically seems to take itself very seriously. So yeah, I did not really engage much with that one. Sorry, Tom.
Just to add on the twist, I do think that twist or reveal that comes up, it feels like the huge oh damn moment where everything kind of comes together to tie in with, I'm not actually, can't really spoil it, but it feels like a really big reveal where the film kind of amps itself up. I kind of agree that it has a pulpy feeling throughout, and that's probably one of the more pulpy elements there that might have worked better if the film was a little bit more stylized, a little bit more faster paced, a little bit more big from the beginning. But I can see why that big reveal would work for a lot of people when it suddenly goes all out into action mode. So I'm not going to criticize it too harshly. It didn't massively impact how I feel about the film either way.
To be clear, I feel the same. I don't feel the reveal has much of an impact.
It probably depends on how well versed you are in Western history, and I'm not that well versed, but from some of the reviews of other people who I was reading, they've said, things that make me think, if I knew a bit more about my Western history, it might have a bit more of an impact. I'm going to keep it there, though, just to keep it brief.
Yeah, it's hard not to spoil anything there, but yes, I think you're very right there, so that the more we know about the Old West, the bigger that reveal will be. Moving on to my fourth favorite film of 2021, we arrive at Petite Maman by Celine Sciamma. And honestly, I don't know how much I want to say about this film either, in order not to spoil anything, though even for those who are already aware of where the film goes, like I unfortunately was, it is still confounding in just how easily and seamlessly everything comes together. Sciamma uses extremely sparse settings, primarily shooting in a single house and the forest next to it, and yet she managed to create a powerful family portrait with raw and emotionally intuitive power. What is perhaps most impressive here is how Sciamma can go from creating the visually breathtaking world of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which is stunning from start to finish, but also a complete epic in many ways, to this smaller work, if you will, that never attempts to dazzle you with style, but rather slowly and earnestly take you into the inner life and logic of children, and making what could be small seem large. What should seem unnatural seem natural, and forge a universal connection that contemplates love, loss, and connection. Petite Maman shows its delicate observance beauty from start to finish, with long takes, few cuts, and there's a lot of room to observe our characters' faces and mannerisms, play, and more impressively, for a film starting with loss, leaving us in this loss, and still remaining tender and life-affirming. The only real flaw here, honestly, at least to me, is that it just feels too short. And that's the only real flaw. It's absolutely phenomenal how it just takes us into the life of, without saying too much, two girls playing, having fun, putting on these shows, and just leaving us right there, even with some more, shall we say, magical elements that you would not expect if it was not spoiled for you.
As the resident Sciamma fan, I guess, because I had Portrait of a Lady on Fire on my top 5 when we did that year, I was really looking forward to Petite Maman. And I liked it quite a bit, but I think it's one of those movies that works a little better with subtitles. I think the reason for that is the performances by the two little girls are kind of dicey. They're not great, they're not bad. And I do think that held me back a little. And I think that otherwise had a lot that I really, really enjoyed. It has been compared, very interestingly, to My Neighbor Totoro. I think Sciamma herself has made that comparison. And I do think it's a worthy comparison. And My Neighbor Totoro is a film I absolutely love. But yeah, I do kind of share your slight frustration, Chris. It's fine to make a film that is small. It's one that is maybe just a tiny little bit too small, but it's still a film I enjoyed a lot. I generally think Sciamma is a masterful filmmaker, very good at drawing out complex emotions, right, as she does in this film, and finding the fantastical also in a story that is really quite simple. So yeah, a film I enjoyed a lot, even though I have some small reservations.
I quite enjoyed this film. It was a gentle and pleasant tale. And contrary to Matteo, I thought that the performances from the two young girls were quite natural and very good. But maybe that's because I was looking at the subtitles when they spoke instead of the faces. So maybe I didn't pick up on the expressions at that point. But they seemed to me to put forward great performances. I did feel that it lacked impact, though, and felt quite forgettable, and perhaps because of its short runtime, it feels a little slight. I enjoyed it while I was watching it, and it is a nice little film, but it didn't have a big enough impact to resonate with me the way it has with Chris and Matthew.
With Petite Maman, I did enjoy watching the girls interact together, and to me the performances seemed alright, although I guess again I was watching it with subtitles. Probably the sticking point for me is that I sort of knew where the film was going from just the title alone. I don't know, we're sort of arguing in the chat at the moment whether the title's a spoiler or not, but I think the choice of title does give away a lot about the film. And I felt there was really little doubt about what was happening, and at the same time, Tiama isn't actually interested in exploring the pseudoscience behind it or giving it any explanation for what's going on. So whether there's something sci-fi going on, whether there's fantasy involved, there's no real commitment from Siama to explore that, because what she's more interested in seeing is how the girls interact, especially with things we later know. I don't know if I could say that, but like I said, I don't think there's really any spoilers in there. So look, it was a pleasant film. Like Tom said, I'd say it's fairly slight, but not so much because of the running length. I think it's just because it's a film where we just sit and observe, rather than a film that actually goes into more about what's happening. And I'm trying to be as vague as possible.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting that I feel completely different from you in that. I think that the fact that it doesn't explain what's happening is the best part of the film. I think that's one of the things that makes it so fantastic, is that it doesn't go into that and lets it just play out naturally. The way this, simple style captures the magic of this experience from the child perspective, and isn't questioning in so many ways. And like the rest of you who read the subtitles, I thought that the performances were really immersive. I think that the chemistry between the characters is wonderful, and that's one of the big highlights of the film. But I can understand that if the delivery is a little bit off in French, it would be a problem.
Something else I just thought I'd mention about Petite My Mum, because I don't know if it was just me when I was watching it, but I actually began to lose track at times of which girl was which. I mean, I know the hairstyle was different, but I don't know. I mean, I guess I'd glance away or whatever, and then look back, and I would try and work out, which one is which. And it wasn't until afterwards I actually looked it up on Letterboxd afterwards, and it's like, oh, okay, it's actually played by identical twins, and they've done it on purpose. So I found that was quite interesting. I don't know if anybody else picked up on that, but I'm just wondering if maybe it was intentional that we are meant to get confused about which of the girls is which.
Yeah, I think when watching it, I wondered if it was actually the same actress, right? Because you can do that now with the magic of technology. I definitely agree that it's an intentional thing for Sema. And I do have to agree with Chris that Sema's focus on the child perspective is really what makes the film work. That's in the wonder, I guess. Okay, so moving on to my number 3. It's technically a French film, though you'd never be able to guess it by just watching it, as it was filmed in Southeast Asia, entirely in Japanese, which makes sense since it's about Onoda, a real Japanese soldier who continued fighting long after the Second World War had ended, isolated with a couple of other soldiers on a small island in the Philippines, as the title of the film indicates, Onoda 10,000 Nights in the Jungle. It's not a film about fanaticism or madness or delusions of grandeur, as Herzog might have made with such a subject, which coincidentally he actually interviewed Onoda and I think wrote a book about it. Rather, it's about how powerful the feeling of belonging can be. The feeling that you found your place in life, your mission, and how far people will go to hang on to that feeling. Onoda is not like Aguirre or Fitzgeraldo, the characters. He's more like Guy Pearce in Memento, constantly finding ways to justify his self-delusion, and Harari, the young French filmmaker who directed this film, finds both the tragedy and the humor in that. He uses the landscape of this island in the Philippines to lend an almost mythological feeling to the film, while also finding the absurdly comic in certain situations, such as the way in which Onoda and his trusted lieutenant will manage to make sense of the radio dispatches they get as the years roll on. It's a very empathetic film, but it's also one that doesn't overlook the consequences of the choice these men have made, because it very much is a choice, but the consequences for the other people living on the island. And it has the rare grace of finishing at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right frame, wisely keeping the story within the parameters of Onoda's own journey. It's a remarkably self-assured film for a young director working in rather unusual circumstances, and I'm particularly impressed with the performances across the board, given the language barrier between cast and crew. But mostly, I value it as another way to use the jungle, that ever so powerful cinematic tool, to explore the madness that is the human experience.
I really enjoyed Onoda, and I would also want to praise Kanji Tsuda's performance as the older Onoda. I think the last half or so of the film is definitely the stronger portion of it. I think that some of the flashbacks to Japan, for instance, felt a little bit flatter. And I would say that I would actually have preferred it if someone like Herzog directed it and made the jungle come alive as a character, or kind of build up the jungle in a different way, though I do agree it feels a little bit mythological. One thing I'll also disagree a little bit on is that you feel the consequences of their action. There's a little bit of that there, but you don't really feel the impact he's making on this community, the fear he is instilling when he's shooting at them, even killing some people early on as well. You don't really feel like those moral consequences stay there. I agree it's a very empathic look at him. I really enjoyed the way that it's both playing up the comedy and the tragedy of it. I would probably prefer if old Onoda had been the main part of the film, because I thought the actor who played him there was just absolutely phenomenal, or if we got even more introspection into just the madness of it all, the logic of it all was keeping him there. I don't think that was explored as thoroughly as it could have been, but it's just a thoroughly good, beautifully looking film that's definitely recommended.
I found it to be a fascinating story, a really great account of what happened there. But I didn't feel that it translated well cinematically, and that's what let the story down. You've got this great location that should lend itself to beautiful cinematography on the island, though I didn't feel that aspect of the film really came to life. I did enjoy learning about the history behind the story, but it didn't quite grab me in the way I was hoping for.
Just quickly, Chris, I do think it makes sense, I guess, that you like the last part more, and that you were looking for more something like a Herzog film. And I think what I like about the film is also the process of how we get there, and how the group dynamic is actually really important. It's not, unlike what the title suggests, it's not really a film about just one guy, right? There's a lead character, but the group dynamics in it, I think, are really key, and that's what I think it really got right for me.
Yes, I definitely agree there. That's one of the more interesting parts of the first half, but there I also felt it was not going into it as thoroughly as I would have liked it to do. But like I said, good from beginning to end.
My third favourite film of the year is a movie that I actually only watched a week ago. It had been in cinemas around here for a few weeks, but it was not a film that I'd made a priority of going to see, because after winning one of the top prizes at Cannes, talk seemed to die down about the film. And when the They Shoot Pictures 21st Century list was recently updated, it did not make enough lists to feature there. So I entered into this film expecting it to be a minor work from its director. What I got, though, was what I considered to be his second best of the 6 films that I've seen from him. The film is A Hero by Asghar Farhadi, which I would peg as his next best film after About Ellie. The film is about a man who's been sent to prison over an unpaid debt, and how he schemes to sway public opinion towards him, and yet how things go awry. With a near constant smile and humble mannerisms, Amir Jadidi makes for an incredibly appealing protagonist. It is easy to root for him, even when he sets out to deceive the public by pretending to find and return a bag stolen by his girlfriend. And I guess along those lines, I guess it's another character that's very similar to Simon Rex in Red Rocket, and very similar to Javier Bardem in The Good Boss. That you've got a character who's not doing such great things, but is still immensely likable. And what really makes the film great for me is that it's not just about getting us on his side, but it's more dynamic than that, because Farhadi also shows us a perspective of the man who put him in jail and his frustration with Jadidi being declared a hero in the media simply for doing what any decent human being should do. And the role of the media and public perceptions in general, and charities and other organizations have worked really well into the fabric of the film. And there are some other things that come up, which I can't reveal without spoilers, but it's just generally a great look at little things gone massively wrong, with Jadidi perfectly playing who's either very smart or very simple, as he's described, and his true mindset is always delightfully mysterious.
Yeah, I love that we're getting just one more film about the schemer character. And this is a lot more of a slow burn, which is usually the case with Farhadi. In fact, I'd probably say that one of the main reasons why it's not on my top 10, even though I think it's a great film, is because a lot of the later Ferrari films, to me, feel like it's lacking that little bit of edge or tension that's kind of just keeps us on the tip of our seats, because there's so many turnarounds and not necessarily betrayals, but there's so many turns and changes here, but that turmoil is not felt viscerally. Rather, the tension is all about melancholy, which I think is a very good and interesting choice. It's essentially just a slow moral tale where we watch in on this one character. We try to figure out his own moral compass, whether or not we should feel empathy for him, whether or not he could indeed be a hero. And it is all just expressed with so much sadness, both about the situation, his exasperation, his love for his son. Even though he's a schemer, he is a far more likable and decent human being than some of the other characters we have talked about and will talk about. So there's just a lot of intriguing little subtle ways that Farhadi just tries to take us not quite under his skin, but leave us on the surface and just observe this man and just figure out how to feel about him and his action. I think that's beautifully done.
I would agree with Sol. It's one of Farhadi's strongest films, and it's heartbreaking to see how the protagonist's good intentions unravel as the film progresses. As Chris said, it's unpredictable, and this keeps it enthralling throughout. And it showcases a director who is at the top of his game, and I really can't wait to see where he takes us with his next film.
Yeah, I'm a massive fan of Asghar Farhadi, and I think this is another of his great films with his trademark clockwork screenplays, right, where it's simultaneously the worlds are closing in on the main character, and at the same time, as a viewer, the world is opening up and you're constantly discovering things that complicate the issue. It's just a masterful screenplay, as always with him, and a really good central performance, which is actually kind of surprising in a way. He plays it very naive, in a way that at times feels fake, and that actually adds to the ambivalence you can feel towards his character. I don't see a big difference in a lot of Farhadi's best films, and I think this is another great one.
I totally agree about the performance, and it's really great to hear, Mature, that you really thought the performance was excellent. Also, because yes, he does sometimes seem insincere and sometimes seems a bit fake. There's lots of things we're uncertain about, like we don't know if the handbag was stolen, it's got the ripped handle, or whether it's been found and then they're trying to pawn it off as being this, returned handbag. And with the woman who comes to collect the handbag, there's a lot of things going on there that we're not quite sure about. And somebody mentioned good intentions. We're not even sure if he actually has good intentions. And I guess that's probably maybe what I like about the film the most, that there's so much we don't know about him. The one thing we do know that is that he is very dedicated to his son, and that really comes out towards the end. And maybe that's one thing that actually might stop him, succeeding. But incredibly interesting character, very interesting situation. And I think it is one of his very best films.
My third favourite film of 2021 is the British drama Help. Now, the harsh reality of the coronavirus outbreak has affected us all, and it remains a sensitive and delicate subject, as we've all had to make sacrifices along the way. Director Mark Munden's made-for-TV movie Help takes a heartbreaking look into the sacrifices made by a young care home worker whose life changes dramatically when the pandemic hits. It's an enthralling work of fiction by writer Jack Thorne, who based his script upon real experiences of those on the front line during this incredibly harrowing time. And his story is a damning indictment against the British government and their poor handling of the pandemic. Now, it starts out as a conventional British drama which focuses on the experiences of Sarah, who's an attentive carer who shows a genuine affection towards the patients under her supervision. Sarah forges a close bond with Tony, a lovable rogue residing in the care home who suffers from early onset Alzheimer's disease and tries her best to please her manager, who doesn't always seem to have the best interests of the residents at heart. Now, the early scenes establish an unnerving feeling of claustrophobia and unease that permeates the care home even before the pandemic begins. The camera focuses primarily on the characters, with their backgrounds often being blurry and out of focus. And this highlights the diminishing capabilities of the resident senses. The care home should be a welcoming environment, but it already feels like a place that is cold and hostile despite the best efforts of Sarah and her colleague. Now, what I really love about this film is its defining sequence, a 26-minute long single take in the centre of the film, which follows Sarah around the care home as the sole worker on her most unforgiving shift yet. She's desperately trying to reach an ambulance or medical support to assist with a patient who is struggling to breathe, but the panic-stricken telephone calls she makes seem futile, and the camera follows her closely down the dark corridors of the care home with the sound and visual impact of the flickering overhead lights that are triggered by a movement, evoking the sensation of being aboard a spaceship. She's dressed in protective gear that eerily resembles a spacesuit, especially when it is bathed in the neon glow of the hallway lights. And throughout this film, the director uses sci-fi tropes to build upon our fears of the pandemic and the virus. And it's a very stressful film to watch, but it's very powerful, and I can't recommend enough.
I think you're spot on there with your comparisons to sci-fi, Tom. I think it's one of the most interesting things about Help is the way that, especially that middle section, it makes you feel like our current reality, or even past reality now, really is the works of a dystopian sci-fi. You really feel that terror and just how unusual this is. And Help is also one of the very few films that actually tackle the corona crisis head on. I would also add to that it's not just sci-fi, there's also horror elements here. In that shift you talk about, for instance, which is probably one of the best scenes in the entire film, it's shot so dark. The way noise is used, the way you feel her dread, it really feels like a horror movie in these scenes. Like this pandemic sci-fi dystopian horror movie of sorts. It's thoroughly hard to watch. And it's so tense, and that's really well done on the director, Mark Munton. I would also like to say that some of the performances there are quite strong, and with the exception of that final act, I don't think many people will be disappointed.
Yeah, I have to echo a lot of what you guys have said, both about the standout scene, what Tom mentioned, it's obviously the high point of the film, and also about what Chris said, which is that it kind of falls off for me after that. It becomes dramatic in a way that does not quite feel natural, that feels a bit artificial, feels a bit like it's there because you have to have this high drama to end the film on. And I'm not sure it entirely works for the character. Jodie Comer is a great actress, and she makes it work. Generally, I think the performances are really good. Stephen Graham, obviously. But also, I don't know his name, but the guy who plays the manager, I think it's interesting that, Tom, you mentioned you don't always think he has his patient's best interests in heart. I would strongly disagree with that. That's not the read I got. I got the idea that he was a man in a difficult position who really does care for his patients. It's just he does not necessarily make the best decisions. But it's the same thing with the main character. She is also someone who we cannot deny her commitments, but she also makes some decisions that are questionable, and that's the whole point, right? They're put in this kind of these impossible positions. And I do like that we have this film on this episode because it is, the COVID movie. And I do think it's important in a sense to have this film that really speaks to what 2021 was as a year. And I think this film has value for that. And again, for the scene that Tom highlighted earlier.
I really like Machua's description of the film as a movie of what 2021 was as a year. It is a real COVID film, and it's probably one of the films that made me most feel like a real movie relevant to what life is like at the moment. Because a lot of movies you're watching it's sort of they seem to be in fantasy worlds without social distancing, without mask wearing, without restrictions. And when films actually tackle the pandemic head on, like one of the films that Chris will be discussing later on does, it just really gets to me in a way that I sort of like don't expect or whatever. So it was really refreshingly, down to earth in that approach. I really just have to mirror what everybody else has said already. I agree about that 26-minute take. I didn't actually realize myself was a single take until afterwards, but it's incredibly well done, especially the pounding music score. Shots going in and out of focus when she's on the phone. You really feel the stress of the environment. The final third of the film does feel like a little bit of a letdown after that hype, but not a major one. The film still concludes an amazing monologue, and I think for me, I was still really with the film at the end, although I do agree, the final third isn't quite as intense. as that strong middle section is. In terms of the boss character, yeah, I felt he was a jaded professional. I felt, well, maybe he'd started off the job a few years ago, maybe a few decades ago, with his heart in it, but he really felt to me like a bit of a pencil pusher. And there, by the time the pandemic hit, and he was just doing stuff that he needed to get done. So I didn't really feel much for him in the film, but definitely feel a lot for Jodie Comer's character. And yeah, it was just really great seeing a film like this, which just really felt like a real movie, rather than all of these fantasy inverted comma films that we see coming out of Hollywood now, when nobody's wearing a mask and there's no restrictions in place or anything.
My third favorite film of 2021 is Ferit Karahan's heartbreaking Brother's Keeper, which is set in a Turkish all-boys boarding school and can best be described as a tale of fear, authority, and accountability. It's told through the eyes of a young child in a world where children are neither listened to nor taken seriously. They're even, quite frankly, abused. The narrative becomes so frustrating and devastating that the hypocrisy on display, despite some pretty comedic touches, just feels scathing rather than making us smile. What Brother's Keeper really succeeds at is not just making us question how these children are treated, but how it contrasts the children and the adults. The quiet, begging child asking for help for his increasingly sick friend is just pain-inducing, while the adults bring in far more of an uncomfortable layer, first punishing, screaming, and ignoring them, and then trying to squirm away from responsibility, making more and more excuses, blaming other people, as it's clear that the child is actually sick and just getting sicker and sicker. There's just a clear sense of desperation and doom, with this sinking feeling that no help can be found. However, it is also likely to fuel the viewer's inner sense of justice and make us enraged and agitated. The film also brings up intriguing questions of blame and who is ultimately responsible for the decisions made, as more and more is slowly brought to light. It's a wonderful film, a frankly beautiful, tragic comic morality tale where we, the audience, are the ultimate arbiter of what's right and wrong, and there's just so much to take away and dissect in this just thoroughly complex and unnerving look at authority or authoritarian behavior and its consequences.
I quite liked Brother's Keeper, which I actually saw yesterday, so it's very fresh in my mind, but I guess I haven't had much time to really think about it. I was reminded of one of my favorite, I think, Turkish movie, Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, which probably says more about how few Turkish movies I've seen, but still, it's, all of these people trying to understand what has happened. It's kind of has this idea of investigation, right? Why is this child sick? How did we get here? And as you mentioned, Chris, it's all because everyone is trying to put the blame on someone else. But that is essentially using this inciting incident to reveal all of the underlying currents of this small society that is a school, and to reveal larger truth about Turkey, and especially this area of Turkey, this region. I do think it's missing a slight bit of, cinematic gusto, I suppose. It's very contained, very, handheld camera all the way through. I think it works for what it's doing, but maybe that's what I'm missing to make it a film that I would love as much as you, Chris. But it's definitely a very good film. I think a very good screenplay, well executed.
It's interesting that Sol had a hero as his number 3 pick, because Brother's Keeper to me feels like a minor Farhadi work, perhaps something he would have made in his early career. That's the kind of feel I got from it. And I had perhaps a similar reaction to watching this as I had with Petit Maman, where I enjoyed the film, but it did feel a little slight and perhaps forgettable. It was engaging whilst watching it, but it's not one that really lingered on my mind for long.
I do think it's interesting that you bring up Farhadi, because Brother's Keeper and the way it immerses into the world of the children is very much akin to what some of the greatest Iranian films have done. And from Abbas Kiarostami to Panahi to so many other great Iranian directors, Iran has in many ways just been known for these films looking at Iranian society, critiquing Iranian society, and doing a lot of this through the eyes of children. And like, you guys haven't seen as many Turkish films as I've seen Iranian films, but I think it's interesting that this film does much of the same thing, but in Turkey. And I think any fans of that kind of film from Iran will probably get a lot out of this one. And this actually brings us up to our second favorite film of 2021. So, Mathieu, you can kick us off once again.
Right, so my number 2 is a film that gave me a very particular sense of satisfaction watching it, the joy even, in seeing a filmmaker finally make his masterpiece. Some might argue that Happy Hour or Asako 1 and 2 were already there, but for me, Ryosuke Hamaguchi's Drive My Car is the fulfillment of the promise made by those films. Why, though? What is it about this film that makes it special? It's not an easy question for me to answer, as Hamaguchi's approach to filmmaking is generally restrained and clinical. But maybe it's the warmth I found in this story that I was missing from his earlier works. Or maybe, and this may sound silly, but maybe it's just the car. Cars may be bad for the environment, but they sure make for a great cinema setting, forcing characters to interact with each other while offering natural movement and variations a filmmaker can work with. And Hamaguchi keeps finding new, though not particularly showy, ways to frame that bright red little car and to explore the dynamics of the characters within it, including one that is essentially a ghost, only present through her recorded voice. Hamaguchi's obvious talent at drawing deep and rich characters is on full display in this film in an almost paradoxical way, as he explores the unknowability of other people. The barriers there, even when we grow closer and closer, we can't ultimately fully break them down. The film is full of those barriers, be it the rigid social structure of Japanese society in general, but also specifically here of a driver and the person they're driving. They're physically separated, and that plays a role in the film, how that evolves. Or the language barrier that the main character is using in his adaptation of the Chekhov play. But it's at its most powerful when it's looking at the way the closest relationships maintain that part of inaccessibility. Can we even connect with the knowledge that we'll never fully know each other? I think this film argues yes, and that we must. A simple statement, really, but I generally find that the simplest ideas are the hardest to express meaningfully. And that's exactly what Hamaguchi manages here, and why it's my second favorite film of the year.
I really like Drive My Car, but given the extreme amount of hype and enthusiasm around it, it was actually a slight letdown. And honestly, I preferred Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy, which is just outside of my top 10. I think the main issue for me with this film, and again, it's a thoroughly good film, it's really damn good, is that it feels a little bit too long, to be honest with you. I think if this has been edited down to, say, a 2-hour film, it could have been great. There's a lot of things here that I feel is distracting from the overall drive. They have elements of their own that works, but be it the performances of the play, all of the cast reads, etc., which is something that Hamaguchi added in specifically for the film. It was not in Murakami's story. That it just don't have the same drive. And it's called Drive My Car. It has this connection between this director and this driver, but that driver feels put on the sidelines due to the majority of the plot focusing on the director, and that makes that part feel a little slimmer as well. So it like I said, it's a very good film, but it just feels like the driver character is a little bit too underdeveloped, and that is spending a lot of time on things that I get your point, Mathieu, that is focusing in on communication issues and whether or not we can know each other, and that's a very good insight in the way to read the film and the way to make the film work, but that did not quite come together for me.
I had quite a similar reaction to Chris. Now, Hamaguchi is not a director I was familiar with until recently, and I've only actually seen Drive My Car and Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy. I have to say that I prefer Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy, though I still had a great ride with Drive My Car. I found the characters were utterly fascinating, and the considered lingering shots allow events to fully sink in whilst you're watching the film, which was great. And I also agree that the hype is perhaps not warranted, although it feels a bit harsh because that's not necessarily the film's fault. It's just received an overwhelming amount of critical acclaim. So obviously hitting the right notes for a lot of people.
I had the very good fortune of being able to watch Drive My Car on movie rather than in the cinema, because it is a sort of film that I might have walked out of if I'd seen it theatrically. And I'm not somebody who usually walks out of movies. But that to me is just how much of a patience test this one was. And it's nice to know, hearing from Tom and Chris, that I'm actually not alone on feeling that the film was very long. To be totally honest, I actually watched the first 17 or 18 minutes in one go, and I was so unengaged with it that I didn't resume my movie stream until 1 week later. I did actually go back when I watched it the second time and rewatch those 17 or 18 minutes again, but I don't know if that made much of a difference. So I guess one of the clinches is that the film takes 40 minutes to warm up. There's a 40-minute prologue, and I can't for the life of me work out why it shouldn't have been more than about 4 minutes. Look, there's a bit going on with the film, and maybe if I was more familiar with Uncle Vanya, maybe I would appreciate it a bit more. The whole idea of performing a play in multiple languages was quite interesting. But yeah, all the interactions with the driver, what Chris said already, she's not a very well built up character. I didn't really feel that bonding connection in there. But I guess when you've got a 40-minute prologue that does, I guess, in my opinion, so little to further the film, it makes it really hard for me to get invested in the film after to get carried along with it. So yeah, unfortunately, Drive My Car for me wasn't a particularly great ride. There's some good ideas in there, but yeah, I think I would have liked to see, a producer's cut of it and managed to get things down to half the length. I'm really sorry.
I mean, don't be sorry, because when you find a film too long, it's just because it's not the length. It's just that you're not really into it, I think. I just want to mention another thing about the play, which you guys mentioned as being maybe, well, Chris specifically, as being maybe an unnecessary element. Aside from my overall point, I do think it's specifically something that speaks to me, kind of like I mentioned earlier with having this little meta moment that Chris loves. I think dealing with languages in this way is something that I'm specifically interested in. And so I found the play fascinating all the way throughout. And I found the inclusion of sign language to be particularly inspired, right? Because it has this visual representation of the whole point of the film. So yeah, I really enjoyed the play, and I think the driver is well developed enough. But yeah, okay, that's fine. If you guys prefer Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy, I'm okay with that. It's in my top 10. Also great.
On to my second favorite film of the year. A few months ago, we recorded a podcast on remakes that are better than the original. And one of the issues that came up in there was whether new adaptations of novels should be considered remakes or readaptations. And I can't quite remember what verdict we reached, but my number 2 of the year is a pretty great film, regardless of what you want to label it as, readaptation or remake. The film that I'm talking about is Guillermo del Toro's Nightmare Alley. So the film is about a drifter with a shady past who manages to weave his way into carnival life and become a successful mentalist until arrogance gets the better of him. And I don't really want to say too much about it because it's one of those films that works best without revealing too much. But Bradley Cooper has a really amazing character and performance in there. On the surface, he is an arrogant jerk, and I guess that's going back to the characters we've talked about, Javier Bardem in The Good Boss, Simon Rex in Red Rocket, the main character in A Hero. We've got a lot of those arrogant jerk characters, and he's one of those also. But he's also at the same time quietly haunted by past memories and misdeeds of things that he's done, which we don't quite realize at first because there's only hints that are dropped along the way. And it's got a great conclusion, even though I could see it coming. It worked really well for me because Cooper's transformation by that point is absolutely staggering. And it's got a whole heap of great supporting performances. I know Kate Blanchett got a lot of shout-outs at the time, but David Strathairn is absolutely awesome as the closest Cooper ever got to a father figure in the movie's Cruel and Bleak World. And just before I pass to my co-host, I just want to mention that I intentionally watched the Del Toro version prior to seeing the 1947 version because I wanted to enter the Del Toro movie as blank as possible. In the meantime, I've seen the 1947 version, and having seen both, I would say that the Del Toro version very much dwarfs the earlier film with a more haunted protagonist and eerie flashbacks. In Del Toro's film, he really comes off as a flawed human being as opposed to a random guy who ends up at a carnival as in the earlier film.
Nightmare Alley is a film that's really close to being a great film for me. It's just thoroughly well done. The performances are strong. It's once again, a film about one of these slime balls plotting and scheming and getting over their heads. And I think Bradley Cooper does excellent in it. I actually prefer the original adaptation. It's shorter, it's more concise. It cuts out some of the scenes that I know you love very much, which elaborates more on the character, which I didn't feel helped this film. I thought it stretched the film out a little bit more. I didn't think it added that much. And essentially, you're here left with 10-15 minutes of Bradley Cooper's characters not speaking at all in the beginning, and you don't really know who or what he is, if he's bright, if he has certain mental issues or mental deficiencies, you don't know, and then suddenly becomes this brilliant mentalist. There's a bit of a build-up there, but I think that the fact that you kind of start him off that blunt and quiet into being this really great showman, when you set it up that way, you need an even more convincing build-up to it. So that's one element I thought was slightly lacking. Almost everything else is done thoroughly well. It's beautifully shot and composed, as all Guillermo del Toro films are. And I haven't read the book, so I don't know if this is more in line with the book and just presenting the story as intended. So I can't comment on that. But yeah, just a thoroughly well done, really good film.
Well, I guess I'll just echo both of you. I do want to reiterate what Saul said about the ending. I think the ending is great, and it feels like what we discussed in another episode, one of those films that kind of all is leading to that one moment, that one line, and it's devastating. I think Bradley Cooper plays it wonderfully, and that scene is absolutely key. And I think one of the key differences between this film and the original is that ending, and I think that's why I much prefer, even though I like the original as well, I much prefer this one. And I think we were all expecting the circus aspect to be exploited a lot by Del Toro, because that's kind of where he leans. And I think he does that great. But what makes the film work is that he never loses the focus on this main character, because that's really what the film is doing. And he does not get too sidetracked, I would say, by the circus stuff, which I think is essential to the movie working.
I haven't seen the original film, nor have I read the book. So I was going into this completely blind, just under the knowledge that Del Toro usually delivers great films for me. I love his world building and his dark undertones and the fantasy settings he delivers. So I absolutely loved the first half of the film in the carnival, establishing all the characters. And as everyone said, there's some great performances. There's some brilliant characters in there. But once the plot shifted for the second part, I wasn't as engaged. I don't know whether, I think it was just the change in setting. It was still enjoyable. I went along for the rides. And I have to say that the ending in particular is very good. But the first half of the film was the strongest for me. And I kind of wanted more of that. I still had a good time with this, although I wouldn't rank it amongst Del Toro's best.
It's really great to hear the generally positive opinions from you guys about Nightmare Alley, because I know when it came out and it got a Best Picture nomination, a lot of people were going, oh, whatever, it's not that good. So it's great to have a bit of confirmation there. With regards to the 1947 version, I know what Chris is saying. The new version is a lot longer, and you have those 15-minute silent shots of Bradley Cooper doing things. You're not sure what's going on. But that's because, at least in my opinion, Del Toro's version is a character study, whereas the 1947 version isn't really. You don't really find out much about his background or what's going on or how he's ended up there, whereas you really find in the Del Toro version, which is, again, what makes the ending so impactful for me, that we see this entire journey and progression of the character. The 1947 version, without giving away too much, actually has the same ending, but it does add a bit more into the end and make it a bit more Hollywoodish rather than the bleak version, which Del Toro goes for. So, yeah, look, I generally do think it's better than the original, if you think about it as remake versus original. And yeah, it just looks fantastic, as Chris mentioned already. Great art direction, great sets. Fantastic music score, yeah, absolutely everything that I tend to love in Del Toro's films.
I'll also just throw in that I agree that adding the first 15 minutes or so does make the ending more impactful, and I'll completely agree on that part.
My second favourite film of 2021 is Last Night in Soho. Now, director Edgar Wright's psychological horror Last Night in Soho is a stylish affair based upon an idea of his that had been gestating for years due to his obsession with 1960s London that came about through listening to his parents' stories of the era and having a fondness for their old record collection. It explores the dark side of show business through a portal into the past that looks beyond the glitz and glamour to highlight the uncompromising situations faced by young girls who are eager to carve out a name for themselves in the seedy clubs around Soho. These visions from the past haunt Eloise, who is played by Thomasin McKenzie, a lonely student who dreams of being a fashion designer when she moves into an old-fashioned bedsit in Soho to escape being treated like an outcast by a mean roommate in her university accommodation. At first, these illusions seem magical, but the strange hallucinatory experiences hide a sinister secret about a crime that took place in her room, a secret that Eloise is compelled to uncover, even though the truth may be downright terrifying. Now, what I love about this is Wright's brilliant visions of the past. They're truly remarkable. His dazzling cinematography and the use of impeccable editing allow for a seamless transition between Eloise's point of view and the actions of a young glamour girl, Sandy, who's played by Anya Taylor-Joy, who is eager to start her career as a singer. As is always the case in Wright's films, the music choice captures the magic of the era wonderfully, transporting the viewer back in time and adding to the hypnotic effect of these mesmerising sequences. His two leads are both utterly captivating, but it is Taylor-Joy who steals the limelight with her knockout performance as Sandy, particularly when her character arc transforms from one of initial hope and excitement to frustration and contempt for the industry she longed to be a part of. There are so many brilliantly inventive flourishes in Last Night in Soho. One that stands out in my mind is a heart-stopping scene where the pure terror in a character's eyes can be seen in the reflection of a knife as it plunges in and out of an unsuspecting victim. However, it is the grand finale that delivers the most nail-biting scene of all, with a staggering showdown on a flight of stairs, showcasing why Wright is one of the most exciting and imaginative British directors working today.
The interesting thing here was that I was really with you for all of that until the very end, because I do think that the ending of Last Night in Soho is the most conventional. It's visually interesting, but it's like in terms of plotting, that is essentially the most traditional pulpy horror showdown for this kind of film that I could have imagined. It fits, it works, it's still a great film to me, and just to be clear, I've just thoroughly enjoyed this film, but that was the one big weak spot I found. What I loved about Last Night in Soho is, in large part, the music. I too love 60s music, and the soundtrack here is just out of this world. And then you also have this really cool, but really simple, basic concept of semi-time travel, of visions linking together, of a slow creeping horror coming forth. It's stylish as every Edgar Wright film is. It has a lot of fun in it, and it's just such a thoroughly engaging journey from beginning to end. The characters too are probably a little underdeveloped, but as always, Anya Taylor-Joy, just with her charisma, she just shines through all of it, even though she's not the lead character. So yeah, great pick, Tom, and just a really cool film from Edgar Wright.
I'm sorry to say that Last Night in Soho was a pretty big disappointment for me. I do think the first 45 minutes or so are pretty great, culminating with that first scene with Anya Taylor-Joy. You both mentioned her. She's wonderful. As always, she's great for this role. And yeah, it's a great scene. It's all that Edgar Wright does well. It's all of the movement that we know he can master. It's great. And then you have all of this setup of this young girl who has this connection with his girl from the past. What does it mean? And I think the film takes the least interesting path from there. And I was really disappointed with how it ended up. I think the secondary characters are paper thin, and that does become a problem. I think that in particular the boyfriend, the boyfriend who's nice, and then he turns out to be nice, and then nicer, and then he's still nice. And I mean, there's something that happens in this film which really should have him running away very fast, and he does not. And I do not understand how that is even possible. So yeah, I think I don't know. I was disappointed with this film, even though I generally love Edgar Wright. I think visually it works, though there is some overuse of CGI in this film. I think in the horror elements that is not always very effective. I suppose. Again, there's that one standout scene, and generally the setting up is generally well done. I just think it doesn't go anywhere that I found particularly interesting.
So, like Mature, I have to say, unfortunately, as an Edgar Wright fan, that Last Night in Soho was a disappointment. I found the setup extremely intriguing, lots of mysteriousness as to what the cause of her visions are, whether they are lucid dreams, hallucinations, or something else. However, the film ultimately never resolves this. And then confusingly, sometimes she embodies the other woman, and sometimes she just observes her from behind glass walls. And look, I really couldn't get my head around what Edgar Wright was trying to do in the story he was presenting with the film. And look, it's well acted. Both actresses are great actresses, and I've liked them in other films, and they're superb here. The supporting characters, yeah, I found them all pretty much stereotypes, not very interesting at all. But I guess maybe the clincher for me is that even though the film looks great, ample doses of neon and everything, what one generally watches an Edgar Wright film for is the humour, and this one is not a comedy.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Sol, because I'm not actually a huge fan of Hot Fuzz or Shaun of the Dead. Wright's humour doesn't seem to work that well for me. I do like them, they're okay films, but they're not amazing, whereas Last Night in Soho worked really well for me, and I think that's because it's more of a serious approach to horror. And like you said, the neon visuals and the sound and everything just really transported me to this excellent world that he created. And I can certainly see where Matteo comes from with the flaws. Yes, some of the supporting cast were a bit paper thin and there were questionable motivations, but at the same time, sometimes when a film speaks to you so well, you're willing to overlook the flaws that other people might find if it doesn't resonate as well with them as it did with you. So yeah, I totally take on board everyone's points, but for me, this is one of Wright's best films, if not his best.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Tom. For me too, it's one of his best films, and that probably comes also down to that I'm not the biggest Wright fan going in. Even if his actual cinema and the way he shoots is great. And it seems like all four of us also have essentially the exact same opinion of the film, which is great visuals, a lot of amazing style, paper thin supporting characters, and a slightly pulpy plot. And then it comes down to, okay, how much did you connect with the concept? How much did you connect with the overall story and ideas? And just how much were you blown away by the style, etc. And for me, I was just completely blown away by the music and style. So if that sounds like something for you, I would probably say that you will enjoy Last Night in Soho. Moving on to my number 2 is a Norwegian film, and it's the first of the 2 Norwegian films we'll be talking about today. This is Grit by Tonje Tøymer Guttormsen, which is frankly one of the most uncomfortable viewing experiences I have ever had. That may, at least to some people, seem like a critique, but there were moments in this film when I genuinely had to press pause or just look slightly away as the unease was simply too powerful. What is impressive is that the unnerving nature of the film does not come from any kind of extreme content, but rather the way pain and agony seep through the screen as our protagonist spirals further and further, safekeeping herself with pretensions upon pretensions, but just always out of her depth. There is a clear sense of desperation to achieve some form of self, some form of self-expression, of finding some kind of value, of accomplishing something. And with desperation, she claws at any kind of hope or chance she might find, and these flesh wounds are felt. This rather unique power is not only coming from the strong central performance of Birgitte Larsen, but from the bold choice by its first-time feature director to mix different levels of visual quality, visual styles and expressions that allow us to just feel how uncertain Grit's inner world is, visually showing how it is shaking and crumbling. It could be tempting to brand Grit, both the protagonist and the film, as just another depiction of a suffering artist. But what appealed so much to me here is that that's really not the case. It is rather the depiction of the suffering of not being an artist. She tells herself, the people, even us as a narrator, that she is this artist with all of these ideas, but she's not. In this narrative, we hear about her projects, her ambitions, but it's just clear that she's so out of her depth that she just might never be able to accomplish any of it. When faced with actually working artists, she is confused by the theories and knowledge they possess. She quickly tries to absorb it, but usually just ends up parroting it with a clear idea that she does not understand it at all. Her internal monologues showcase not just pretension, but this false image of herself, and just how desperately she needs this image just to function. She deceives others, she deceives herself, and she gets into more and more painful situations and confrontations as she tries to keep everything afloat. To cut this summary down, Grit has a despairing and desperate energy that is rarely seen, and a cringe and unnerving factor comparable to Dogma and Östlund. And if that sounds like a film for you, it probably is. But if not, maybe this is one of those films you should shy away from, because this is a film that I can see you going either way on. It's a film I think it would also be really, really easy to hate. So you have been warned.
Yeah, I'm sure many people would have expected us on this episode about 2021 in film to talk about a Norwegian film about a young woman who's really lost, who has a lot of temporary passions about some things. She's really flighty. She doesn't know what she's going to do. And the whole film, we're following her. But this one is a bit more, I guess, less sympathetic than the other one. This is really a film that espouses, I think, the characters in terms of the filmmaking, right? It's always unsettled, always moving, and not necessarily moving in a way that makes sense. And I think you mentioned it being uncomfortable, and I guess that's what I found uncomfortable about the film, more than the company of this character, who is quite unlikable. It's also the way it's filmed, right? The way the director chooses to, again, really be in sync, I guess, with its main character, and in a way that I could never quite be. So I was always looking kind of outside in. And it's a bit hard because this is such a difficult character to empathize with, or at least I found it to be. So I was always at a remove from the film. I understand what it's doing, but in the end, I was never quite on its wavelength. But it's definitely an interesting contrast to The Worst Person in the World in a subject that is surprisingly similar.
Like Matthew, I found it difficult to empathise with the lead actress. But I've got to say that I always admire Chris's eloquence in repping the films that he loves, because it always makes me feel like I need to give the film a second chance if it didn't work for me the first time around. And Grit didn't work for me the first time around. I agree that the central performance is fantastic, but story and the unremarkable handheld camera work did little for me. It wasn't a bad film, so to speak. I just struggle to connect with it. So if you have similar sensibilities or tastes, Chris, then it is probably worth checking it out. And there is a chance that I may revisit it further down the line.
Really happy to hear that, Tom, and I completely agree with you, Matthew, in terms of it's really odd. Like, almost twin film idea with the worst person in the world. I mean, you could easily have changed that title. And they're both, created in clear chapters. There's so many overlaps in what it does. The only real difference is that Grit has, a far more off-putting and unlikable character at the center of it, and that it goes down some different paths in how it's set up. And a lot of comparisons can be drawn there.
The comparisons that are being made between Grit and Worst Person in the World are quite interesting. I didn't actually think of them myself beforehand. Overall, Grit worked much better for me than Worst Person in the World. I'll probably agree that the main character in Worst Person in the World is probably a bit more likable, but I guess I found the protagonist in Grit a lot more interesting. She is very self-absorbed and she doesn't really take that on board. And I guess the first hour of the film, I wasn't really getting into it. She's got a friend with Down syndrome who's trying to be a film director, and I found that character a lot more interesting. And the first half of the film going, let's get back to that character with Down syndrome. This is where the film is at. And yet, in the second half of the film, it actually goes in a slightly different direction. I don't want to spoil it too much, but you'd see a bit of character growth there in the way that she reinvents herself, I guess, to try and put it mildly. And I would say that second half of the film is much stronger than Worst Person in the World. You actually see what's happening with her. You actually see the transformation. And there's just some really, memorable parts in there where she gets really into things and she's telling these old friends off that they shouldn't have kids right in front of their kids. You've got a real pounding, unsettling music in there. So yeah, the second half of Grit really worked for me to the point where I'd say that you've got Grit, you've got The Trip, you've got my number one film that we're going to discuss shortly, and I'd say all three of those films are superior Norwegian films to the one that actually ended up getting 2 Oscar nominations.
Yeah, thanks all. And I also completely agree on the character with Down syndrome, which is played by a person who also has Down syndrome, and it's probably the best supporting role in the entire film. And I think it's so interesting there because, Grit is a friend, but she's also like the support contact, so she gets paid for being with this woman. And this woman with Down syndrome is essentially a more accomplished artist than Grit, and you can feel how annoyed she's by Grit is by this to an extent. Like you can feel her envy, which is also really interesting and uncomfortable. So there's all of these things playing in, and like Saul mentioned, this truly has been a strong year for Norwegian cinema, something I'm sure we get back to when Saul reveals his number one film of 2021. But looking at the time here now, I think it's probably best to make this two-parter. So, as always, we will return in 2 weeks where we will reveal our number one film choices of 2021. So, thank you so much for listening and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.